ended by 9 in respect for everybody's time. So welcome to our first meeting of the governance task force. And we put together some materials just to help sort of guide the discussion. And my hope for this meeting is really just to have a discussion about what we hope to accomplish, sort of next steps, maybe even a timetable for our work based upon not only the board retreat that we had earlier in the year, a couple months ago, but also just some of my conversations with Carter. So before we get into, we had put together some slides and that hopefully can help guide the discussion, but I really wanted to thank Lori and Connie and all of the staff for their assistance with helping to get us organized and kicked off. So I know that we had sent around some materials, the governance plan, the bylaws, the listing of the board members and terms, and also the Carver policy governance model, which is the model that our governance plan is based off of. So if you turn to the next slide, Stephen, if you might, I really do just want to mention, I really look forward to working together on this task force as we determine sort of the best governance model going forward. And it may be that there aren't many changes to it, but that's really something for us to discuss and then recommend to the board. So here is the agenda. I think that you have seen this before. As I said, I really expect that we should be able to adjourn by 9, but part of, as you can see, right near the end, we'll really have the discussion in terms of where we go. So this is the members of the task force, just so you're aware of who we are, and Carter, as the chair, is an ex officio member. So again, thank you for joining us. So any thoughts or questions before we kind of get into the meat of things from anybody? Okay. So, and we can send out, we will send out the slides after the meeting, and you can just spend some time after the meeting on this particular slide. So this slide just really goes through and just really talks about some of the things that we may want to think about as we go forward and do our work. On the left, you can see just some principles of good governance. I'm not going to read them. You'll have time afterwards. As you can see, a lot of these, as I've read them, really are focused on kind of governance of governmental bodies, but I think a lot of the principles really do resonate and are things that we should keep in mind. On the right-hand side, what you'll see are 4 models of governance for nonprofits, which of course is what the board is. And there are these, different, as I said, models. We are right now, where the star is, the policy board model is how we are functioning now. And as you kind of look at the other ones, just advisory, really just where you're just kind of high level influence to the CEO. And then you can see it goes down to the management team model, which is really direct management by the board. And you have a cooperative model and the policy board model. And Lori will be talking about a little bit more in terms of the Carver model that we have been operating under. So if you go to the next slide, please, Stephen.
Working on that one moment.
There we go. Problem. So just to kick us off here, one of the things is I was talking with Carter, and I believe is in a couple of the emails that were sent around. So our particular task force and the board, if you've read the bylaws, we have no standing committees, but I think we can also call ourselves a committee, which is also referred to in the bylaws, but it's not a standing committee. So we've been constituted to review, discuss, and then present to the full board our recommendations of what the role of our board is and the best way for the board to function going forward from a governance perspective. And part of that will certainly be the review of our governance plan and bylaws. to determine if any changes should be recommended. As I was reviewing both of these things again yesterday in preparation for the meeting, we are, and in my discussions with Lori, we are probably one of the few boards that actually has a governance plan. I think one of the things that would be interesting for us to think about is whether, in light of bylaws, we need the governance plan. I don't have any preconceived notions about any of this. I think it's really something that we should really think about and really discuss in terms of how it's been used to sort of guide the board in the past, and whether it is something as we go forward, make that recommendation. So in the next bullet, I went back to the survey that was done, or the write-up of the survey that was done by Haskell Consulting and the report that they put out. And based upon the survey that was done of all of the board members, what that summary is that our committee, governance committee, and you'll see the various things that, at least based upon feedback from the board, they thought would be within the purview of the governance committee. And as you'll see, and I will quickly go through them so we can really, because I think this is really something for us to think about and discuss, and I'll open it up here just in a minute. So the first is really the first bullet, and actually to the second to last bullet, I think they kind of go together. The first is really the participation in the nominations process. So really board selection, who's going to be on the board. There is the Dallas County Judge and the Dallas Mayor. They actually make the recommendations and appointments, but is there some process for the board to actually, have some input into that? Should it be formalized? What should that be in terms of our recommendation? And I think related to that is the second to the last bullet, which is actually board member performance and just kind of a self-evaluation of how the board is functioning and how particular members of the board are participating, and if there is something there. So again, these are all things that came out of that survey. Whether or not that is part of our recommendation, I think that's all part of what we can discuss. This meeting is not for making those decisions in my mind. It's really just some of the things as we go forward and we have particular work streams. These are things that came up, and there may be more as we discuss. Second thing is the board orientation. How are new members onboarded? What does that look like? What should that be? The third thing that came up in the survey was monitoring conflicts of interest, whether they're declared or unanticipated. Fourth is the policies, making sure that the organization has updated policies. There are a number in my discussions with Lori, there's a number of things that we may actually, because of various regulations or rules, there are certain policies that the board, that the organization needs to have. We may not have the ability to actually influence them. So that's something to discuss. And then in terms of what are the lines in terms of responsibilities between management and the board. So as I said, those are the things that came up in that survey as reported by Haskell. So now I just really would be interested in opening it up to the committee or anybody. I don't know, Lori, if you have any thoughts about, I know in terms of the policies we had talked, and there were a couple comments you had. So maybe I'll turn to you, Lori, first, just for any comments on anything in terms of whether there are any guardrails on any of these things based upon regulations or law that we need to be mindful of. And then I'd like to open it up to the members of the committee for their kind of thoughts about any of this, and whether there's additional things or anything on this particular list that you thought, gee, this just doesn't, we should just put that to the side. So Lori?
Sure, thanks. We were really strong in utilizing the Carver model. I think in the last 8-10 years, we fell off. It wasn't just COVID. Alan, you may have the original book. You and Michelle both would have received a textbook on boards that make a difference. If we're going to have a model, that's probably the cool one to have. But we y'all know the rules. You've seen all the rules. Connie prints them every month. No local flexibility. Every grant comes with some pretty solid rules. Even my salary, any director's salary, is governed by an executive order of the president. The latitude is limited, but the exposure is real. So there are ways that I think this board should shore up what is happening. I don't know that there needs to be a governance plan. I asked around, many of the boards kind of went, huh? And others said, yes, we're using the original founding documents that Dr. Bob McPherson wrote back in the 1995, 96 era. And those are secured at the Ray Marshall School at UT. There are some documents, there's some theory behind this, but if we stick to what we have, that's kind of ironclad. When I came here in the late 80s, this was a management team model. We had a committee for everything, a procurement committee, a planning committee, a monitoring committee, et cetera, et cetera. And the board was quasi-dysfunctional. We had no limits on the chair, so the chair stayed and stayed and stayed. The chair in Houston has been there over 25 years as the chair. There are things that can happen. I mean, and we have not had that since we had this government model. Things have moved along. What hasn't moved along, evaluation of the CEO got off track several times. I went 4 years one time, twice without an evaluation. Kathy Frazier put that back in force, tried to stabilize that piece. So there's work of the board. Oh, and you know what else we talked about, Joanne, was a board member job description. They tried to create that in the late 90s and nobody ever came through on it. Ken can tell you a little bit about recent work we've done with him. As a chamber, he can sign off on nominations to the mayor and the judge. And it's a lot of work. And then, Ken, we sometimes don't hit the mark, do we? The mayor's going to do what the mayor's going to do. Yeah. But go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing.
There's certain things that you've got here that I think deserve attention and recording it. It could be in the bylaws. It could be in a modified governance plan. I will say we have had a modified Carver model. I would not say go with a strict model. It's Australian. It's been used worldwide by academicians, but we modified it as necessary. No executive committee. Please understand that is not even available to you in this government world. No small group should be making decisions that must be made by the whole. Look at that composition. I mean, the law was very specific. 51% must be private sector, nonprofit and union, 15%, all of these different people. If you try to modify that to an executive committee, you miss the mark. And I think there could be serious repercussions for a questionable decision. That's all I've got for now, but I'm here to help, guys. Thanks.
Thanks, Lori. And we did talk about board membership criteria, job description, so maybe we add that to the list. So opening up to the committee, and Miguel, thanks for joining us, really appreciate it. Is there anything, just any kind of reactions, thoughts about the above list? Any items that you think are not feasible? Anything we should add?
Yeah, go ahead, Harry.
As a very broad reflection, I would say any deviation at all from something that's written down or something that's become a practice or a course of conduct, we just have to have an overriding compelling reason to do that, because every time you do deviate and then we run into some issue, then when we try to do the postmortem of why, the easiest thing for someone to blame would be, oh, well, you deviated from practice, procedure, and rule. I just think it's not prudent for us to do that unless we have an overriding interest. And then I'm all in favor of it if we want to do that.
So I'll kind of structure my thoughts into three categories. One is overall kind of the system alignment between the state system and local workforce boards. Second, I want to talk about the Carver model and our implementation or lack thereof implementation of the Carver model as a board. And then third, this list that you've got up. So I think any governance model that we put in place, it would be very instructive. If you remember kind of at our retreat, there was an orientation document that was put out by the state of Texas and the Texas Workforce Commission, which very clearly lays out the Texas Workforce Commission's philosophy on what a local workforce board should be, what the role of specific board members as individuals is, and what the role of a local workforce board itself is. Now, we also have a nonprofit structure which has bylaws, but all of these things are important. The state is counting on us to, as a board, as individuals, and as part of their system to fulfill the duties as the system is designed. And then also, we need to make sure that's aligned with whatever bylaws and whatever governance model we have in place. And I'm not sure that I've stayed up to date. As Lori mentioned, some of our documents go way back as far as 1995. They haven't been updated as the state has put out new rules or new philosophies. And so, you know, I think an alignment check would be certainly something worthwhile. Second is the Carver model. I don't actually have any issue necessarily with the Carver model itself. My problem is that the Carver model only works if you really fully implement the Carver model. We have kind of a Frankenstein version of the Carver model in place where there's certain principles that we pull out, but we're not actually doing them all. So, for example, like even if you were to go back to the slide a couple of slides ago that laid out the various nonprofit models, could we do that for a second?
Here we go.
Okay, this says here that with this governance method, the board grants most of its authority to the CEO, allowing them full control over the organization it's working. The board becomes second in command of the organization. That is absolutely not true. That is absolutely not the Carver model. I want to be really clear that this is directly, I'm going to put in the chat, directly from Carver's writings. Which is, it's important that the board maintain, the board creates the CEO does not create the board. The board is always in this model accountable and as the owner of the organization. In fact, I'm going to put in one more, drop in one more line. Consequently, in every case, the board is totally accountable for the organization and has therefore total authority over it, including over the CEO. This is Carver's writings. And I think it's really important. Again, I'm a believer in sort of one employee principle of governance. But I think it's important that we are not having a situation as we set up for new leadership, as we set up a new governance model, that this is not a situation where a CEO is governing the board, but actually the board is taking its responsibility of governance extremely seriously, including part of the Carver model, which is the creation of what the board meetings themselves are. So here's what Carver writes about board meetings, and I'm just gonna, and also what he writes about committees. So it's really important that the board take responsibility for its own job, and the board meetings become the board's meetings rather than management's meetings for the board. Board meetings occur because of the need for board members to learn together, to contemplate and deliberate together, and to decide together. Board meetings are not for reviewing the past, being entertained by staff, helping staff do its work, or performing ritual approvals of staff plans. As a result, many board meetings may not look like traditional board meetings at all, but learning and studying sessions or joint meetings with other boards, particularly in communities where boards rarely talk with one another. This is the Carver model. And sort of the last part is Lori is 100% right when she talks about the executive committee in terms of a voting committee. What the Carver model talks about in terms of committees is that committees might help sort of do deep dives and to provide guidance to a board and board decisions, but the board as a whole, as a single body, is responsible for all of the decisions. So we could use committees, but it's not for the committee to take votes in absence of the board. It's for the committee to be a tool of the board to learn. So anyway, I just say, if we are going to keep the Carver model, if we're going to be a policy board, then we actually have to be a policy board. And that requires a lot of rigor, and it requires a different way of working than we have been working, at least for the time period that I've been a part of the organization. Third thing is, I'll just say, I think that this list that you had, if you go back in terms of what came out of the survey, really great. And you don't necessarily need an entire governance model for it. Every one of those things we could strengthen independently. Those could be put into bylaws, strengthened. So I think that's a great list and really a good guide for some of the work of this committee. That's all.
Great. Well, thanks, Alan. And I think those are all really important points. And I think the system alignment is, as we do our work, is going to be really critical as well. And really understanding, you must have read the book on the Carver model. I don't have it, but I actually think those are really some great points as well. And as you'll see, one of the work streams is really looking at, and as I understand it, and it's really for the recommendation of this committee, and it could be that we are true to everything about the Carver model. I'm not as familiar with it as you certainly are. Or there can be some modifications for what makes sense, and there may need to be, depending upon that system alignment. So I think that's really, really important, good discussions to have. But I really do also, just in terms of good governance and just thinking about at least the company that I am in terms of the obligations of the board members to, in our case, it's stakeholders, but really just even beyond just certainly being just a rubber stamp and not taking their responsibilities seriously. And I think actually the board orientation and participation in the nominations process, in terms of getting my own personal thoughts, in terms of getting board members to be engaged, that really is something that could be something that, if we can work some of those things in through what we're doing, through the processes and systems, I think that would be great.
Joanne, if I could just offer, and Alan's spot on, one of the reasons I say it's a modified Carver, and the reason it would have to remain thus, is because of the governmental funding and the fact that our CLEO, chief elected official, the judge, sort of has a counter vote to the boards. And I will tell you, there are some boards that operate that way, where Fort Worth is a good example, Tarrant County, the 3 elected officials come together quarterly with the board. And in whatever world you want to live in, they can reverse the action of the board at that point. And I think in my situation, you've seen the CLEO has a lot of authority. They appoint board members, they ask board members to resign. So that's why the totality of the board under Carver is sort of limited because of this governmental superstructure. I just throw that in, Alan. We said we had to make it strange because of that. And that is one reason why you can't be totally true to it. Something else can come in. I think we've been very lucky that our chief elected officials have not, and the only one is the judge. He has an agreement that says the county judge is over the whole county, and he doesn't choose to meet with us. He doesn't choose to watch what the board does every month or quarterly, but some boards in Texas do this. And it's, to me, it's sort of undermines the authority of the board in the first place. It shouldn't happen, but that's out there. So I just offer that. That's why I called it a modified.
Yeah, Lori, you're absolutely right. I mean, just one quick point, speaking of alignment, is the state policy refers to the CEO as judging. And meanwhile, we have another sort of title that we put in our organization called CEO. We might very seriously consider, as we're hiring, to make that executive director, just to avoid that confusion, because it is confusing when we're looking at the policy versus when we're looking at the implementation.
The chief elected should be the CLEO, C-L-E-O. And I think that's TWC's error. They keep calling it CEO. The CEO is already done away with. And problem is, our bylaws call my job a CEO, president CEO. But the job to find a successor was actually published as executive director. So part of it has been taken care of, but now there's a misalignment to the bylaws. So that does have to be remedied. So the new incoming is that's the publication was as an executive director. So part of that got taken care of. Thanks.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for joining. Appreciate it.
Sorry, I'm late. Thank you all.
No, completely understand. Any other thoughts by any of the committee members?
Nothing as profound as the legendary Alan Cohen, but I would say that, in my naivete, I went on ChatGPT yesterday and asked ChatGPT what should be considered in our first governance committee meeting of the governance task force meeting of the Workforce Solutions Greater Dallas. And believe it or not, it came back with exactly what Joanne has listed here. So it's very complimentary to what Alan said in his third comment. I think this is a really pretty comprehensive list.
ChatGPT is great.
Right.
I have a few thoughts.
Great.
I was just trying to type into ChatGPT myself. So
Just remember, nothing that you put there is confidential.
oh, are you serious? Oh my God. I'm ruined. My apologies for being delayed. I took this first day of school in Dallas ISD, so I was dropping off a little kindergartner to
Oh, wonderful. Oh, it's such a great age.
It is. I got a chance to, I heard some of what Alan was saying over the phone and then caught the tail end of what he said as I put my computer up. And I wholeheartedly agree with what he said. I think the thing that so the first general question that I have, and perhaps Joanne, this is a rhetorical question, so don't feel like I'm putting you on the spot in any way. But when you started this off, the ambiguity in your voice as to what the purpose of this group was, or the structure of this group, as you stated, we're kind of a governance committee, but maybe we're not a governance committee, but we're going to be a governance committee. In many ways is sort of the epitome of, I think, how I've thought about the Workforce Solutions Board and my role on it up to this point. It has been an honor to be able to be involved in this work. And for as much as I've been able to, I've tried to participate and learn, and in times where I couldn't make meetings, tried to do the research and follow up with what was discussed at the board meeting. And still feel like for all of the boards that I've been on, and I've been on quite a few nonprofits and also as an elected board member in the Dallas ISD School Board, this is the one that I feel like I don't know my place. And to some extent, Lori, your explanation a little earlier, there are certainly a whole host of things in this workforce ecosystem, which include things that have been dictated by law, this quasi nonprofit / government entity, elected officials that have to be involved, who could overturn decisions that the board makes, the fact that we're appointed by elected officials, all of those things resonate with me. And certainly, if I were to put myself in your shoes as the actual person who has to run the organization, a ton of stuff that could easily make your job a job not worth wanting to have. I get all of that. And with all of that aside now, I still, after reviewing our bylaws, reviewing some of the Carver model myself, think that this is a board that doesn't have as many constraints as we have created for it to have. For example, the fact that we don't have very basic committees, or haven't to this point, or perhaps had in the past and got away with and had them again, things like a governance committee, just to ensure that we are making, scrutinizing the work of the board over time, is one that I feel like we to some extent, from a board member standpoint, I feel sort of derelict in my fiduciary responsibility to ensure that we can live up to the governance responsibilities that I feel like, even with the ambiguity that exists, we still owe, at the very least, to the people that appointed us to this board. And so, I'm hoping that we see this governance committee as a path towards helping our own board members gain clarification as to the role and responsibility that we have, and provide us the ability to be able to actually leverage our knowledge and our skills and our talent to help in parallel with the CEO, deliver results for people who are looking to find jobs in our community. Okay. One major thing that I feel like, I've heard, do we have a governance plan or do we have just bylaws and so on and so forth? Regardless of what we do, I think it's inevitable that we need to start with bylaws. Joanne, as you mentioned, we will do and review those bylaws because there's a whole host of, I think, opportunities for improvement that could manifest through discussion around our bylaws. So my hope is that will be one of the things ideally that we take on at a very early stage of the governance committee's work. But then the second thing that I hope that we all will just sort of keep in the front of our mind as we do this work together is how do we make the board member experience more than just trying to ram in information from 7:30 a.m. to 9 or 9:30 a.m. once a month. Because I'll tell you what it feels like I've experienced over the past 2 years, and this is, I want to make sure that I am crystal clear as I say this to everybody on this call. There's no blame to be had that I'm putting anywhere, okay? I want to be very clear. But I feel like I show up to a meeting and I might as well just go sit in the group with the rest of the people that are coming there from the public, because I'm receiving a ton of information very early in the morning, and then I go off and then I come back a month later and I do the same thing. We have to figure out a way through this governance committee to think about how we structure this in a way that is not just sit and get and move forward, to be a real asset to our management while striking the balance of not managing through the board, because that is the worst thing that we can do. When I got elected to the Dallas School Board in 2013, I saw how bad a board can get. So I clearly understand why through over time, this thing is iterated towards having the CEO really running the show. That makes complete sense to me. And it was a great job in getting it to be that. My question though is, how can we find that right balance while ensuring that the board does not become a micromanaging board? Because then we're back to square one. Thank you, Joanne.
Well, thank you, Miguel. I think those are really, really great comments. And I know that I have experienced and share a lot of those same feelings about, my own sort of engagement and participation. And so I suspect that those are not unique by any stretch. And I think that really is an opportunity for this committee. So thank you. Great. So the next couple of slides are really about the Carver model. I don't know, Lori, given our conversations, whether we need to spend much time on these or any, but.
No, we don't. I think what we need to do maybe is share the PowerPoint after the meeting. Connie, if you just make sure everybody gets a copy of it. This graph may be helpful. Alan's already kind of talked through it and I've mentioned some stuff, but this is the intent of it. And if you notice, the problem is that, and I will tell you, I wish Justin was on. He wasn't able to make it this morning. The Carver model was brought to us by Dallas College, but Dallas College, after Bill Winrick, abandoned the model for reasons that might be interesting if Justin is aware of that. There's plenty to suggest. I think we go back. Alan and Ken, you both run nonprofits. Do you have a governance model or just bylaws?
We just have bylaws,
Yes.
no governance model.
And I used to be on Alan's board. Alan, you don't have committees, do you?
Well, you were on an advisory council, but you were not the board. But I will say, like, I have not only no problem, I really like a board having one employee so that the CEO can run management. I mean, I actually do really like that distinction. I don't think that so anyway, I'll just say that.
At Commit, we have a governance committee. We have a finance committee. We've now set up a philanthropic committee to help with fundraising. Over in DISD, we had a governance committee, we had a finance committee, we had an audit committee.
And we have finance committee that we have always had, which keeps us very, very clean according to all sources. The only one that I think is going to be critical this round is the outreach committee. And outreach would mean that thing that we can't do, which is notoriety out in the community. It's the awareness conversation of what's going on in our system, social media being covered, that kind of thing. And that is one of the three committees that were created. And you normally call it a marketing committee, but we can't do that because you can't market with government money unless you're a school. We just can't market. So it's a good thing to share. I've got pamphlets, books. I just can't get enough of them for a board of 25. The Carver materials are quite expensive now and a little hard to come by. So I'll do what I can to share pieces of things. Alan, you do the same if you see any other graphics that help people to process this a little quicker than reading the novel. It's a pretty extensive book and it's very theoretical. But I'll leave it at that, Joanne. I think more discussion is really a good idea.
Okay, so if we could turn to the next slide, maybe just in our remaining time, and if we use it all, that's great. If we don't need it all, that's fine too. But I thought really it would be great in this kickoff meeting to really think about, okay, how do we want to operate? How do we want to go forward? How often do we want to meet? Is it monthly, more than that? What I thought, of course, this is all really subject to the committee's discussion and if there's any adjustments, really to have particular work streams as opposed to the committee trying to tackle each of these subjects. And then the work of the work streams can actually, we may be able to or want to bring in others to support some of the work streams, whether it's staff, whether it's outside counsel, whether it's other board members. And these are the ones that I thought might make sense. And you can kind of see them. And then as we have our meetings, the work stream groups can actually work, in between meetings, and then we can have our meetings of the full committee and discuss kind of the progress. And you'll see and of course, one of the work streams, maybe the most important in terms of the final work product, is the governance plan and the bylaws. As I was kind of thinking about all of this, it's kind of like the chicken and the egg thing, because depending upon what some of the other work streams are, if we're going to take on the nominations process or the board orientation process and put that in to our bylaws, it'd be nice to know what the work stream recommendation is around that. So, whether one comes first or whether there's some overlap, that's something we'll just have to figure out. But why don't we start with the idea of work streams as opposed to whether we all want to just kind of tackle, have a meeting to tackle each one of these things. And then we can really get to our meeting cadence and schedule for our work. So any thoughts about any of this? Kind of open up to the committee.
We're going through a bylaws update right now in sort of my other organization. And I'll say part of what we're doing is really highlighting areas that might also be for further discussion to leave it open for amendment. So, we'll probably adopt bylaws and then continue to have conversations, whether they be about something as simple and mechanical as term limits, or whether they be as sort of nuanced as conflict of interest policy. And that's the one that I'm actually I'll say that's the one that concerns me the most on this board. And it also concerns me on my own, and one where I'd like personal guidance on. So, and professionally, I deal with a lot of the issues or intersect with a lot of the issues that we deal with workforce and deal with a lot of organizations. Some of that's by design of clearly, but I also see lots of financial relationships that occur sometimes between organizations that folks represent in their professional lives and some of the grantees that we have workforce, and it's not always, and I see lots of folks participating in those discussions. That isn't necessarily bad or good, but I don't think we're as clear, or I'm certainly not as clear on when do we have a dual interest, when do we have a conflict of interest, when do people really need to remove themselves from conversations, when should we be like utilizing our relationships to really lean in and make that an advantage for the board.
So Alan, question, in the other groups where they're looking at the bylaws now, do you have sort of a small group looking at that? Do you have outside? What, I mean, and just based upon your experience of what's been good with those or not so good, do you have any recommendations? Is it like a small group of this committee or one sort of coming back to this committee? What do you think?
So I'm a believer that committees can be really helpful to give a small group of people the ability to really deep dive. However, ultimately, part of the role of a committee in my mind will be to inform and lift up the really relevant decision points to the larger board so that the larger board walks away feeling like they really, have a strong understanding, and then ultimately the decision lies with the entire board. But I think it's helpful. In this case, it may require splitting up into each of these areas, a small group to tackle them. But however you might structure it, it's hard to have a discussion with 25.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, my thought was to actually maybe have somebody volunteer for each of these various, because, for instance, like the nominations process or the board orientation in terms of what's done. I think there's a lot that goes into each one in terms, and as you said, all of these, the conflicts of interest, the policies. I mean, there's a lot behind each one of those, I think, just to kind of wrap your head around, just kind of understand. And before we certainly take any recommendation to the full board, it'd be great for this committee to understand it. And it seems to me there may be, a smaller group to discuss with this committee. Or maybe we have meetings and we tackle one, we get the background and we tackle one at a time. Really kind of open for how we think this could actually be most efficient. Really thinking about, when do we hope to have our work done, our work meaning a recommendation to the full board in terms of, I think, a governance plan and bylaws.
To me, it feels like if we don't better understand what the either governance plan and or bylaws situation is, it's really hard to do any of the other bullet points. You can't, so right, because we couldn't nominate someone if we didn't know, we couldn't suggest nominations or review nominations if we didn't know whether or not that person might be prepared to execute whatever is stated in the bylaws. Like, can't orient anyone. We want to orient them around generally what the bylaws are. So for me, it feels like starting with the bylaws and perhaps a discussion among the group. Maybe even it's, every person has like a section that we review with potential suggestions that we could then bring forward to the rest of this group, a month from now or whenever the next meeting is. And then perhaps bringing this to the full board, to Lori's point, so that we're not making any decisions, but perhaps making suggestions to the full board and a presentation as to what amendments may be proposed for discussion and potential ratification. That then establishes the foundation for us to then build everything else out, all as suggestions then to the full board in time for an ultimate vote. But just my thought.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Good idea, I think.
I was gonna say, I totally agree. It's just too much to unpack in the bylaws that it's just a lot. And so if we could take it by sections, then I think we're all fully learning and understanding at the same time collectively, and then we can go through the rest.
I was thinking, Joanne, I was kind of thinking about what Miguel said, Alan said, and kind of synthesizing. I think in the nonprofits that I serve on boards, we have delineations between advisory board and the board, and it sort of automatically and comfortably allows for some of this distinction. And I think with our 25, it's a little more, I think we have a blend of people that are not really fully into the weeds and engaged, and others that want to be. So it's somewhat cumbersome. I'm not saying that I have a solution for that or a distinction, but I think that's just a reflection of why it sometimes feels like we're drinking out of a fire hose forever. We never get past that point of feeling like we're drinking out of a fire hose.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Joanne, if I could put some suggestions forward, I think January is kind of a bellwether. So January 24th, we've moved the meeting to the 4th. There's 5 Wednesdays, and so the 4th Wednesday is 24th, giving people time to return from the holidays. I would imagine Carter would ask for the committees to report at that time on anything substantive. The board speaking to the board has not occurred, but there's nothing stopping you. So, I mean, I think that's the next step. Is the bylaws are in really good shape. They were written by our lawyers. Reed is now available, not John Dickey. Reed is our new attorney at BT Law. It is in procurement right now for legal services, but I think we could continue to work with Reed. Bylaws should be a by exception conversation. The bylaws are really sharp, but showing bullets where you want to shore it up. It doesn't all have to be done by January, but let's talk about what's not happening. And I popped 2 things in the chat. Conflict of interest, Alan, you're spot on. It's a combination of state rules. The state dictates a lot in our guide, Robert's rules, and then the board never monitors the conflict. It's left to the staff, and that shouldn't be the case. We have questions sometimes of the elected officials when they appoint people to the board. I can only push that so far, as you well understand. But there's something to be said about the board speaking to the board, and that would be very helpful, I think, and not just the chair, vice chair, and treasurer speaking to the board, but members speaking, directors speaking to directors. So again, we have no members. We are a director board. And so happy to help in that for as long as I'm here. We are talking about me because of the delay, I think, in finding the new exec. And there were more meetings last week. Something should be coming soon. But my last day will probably not be September. It will be stretched out as an advisor. And so that advisor role, I hope to be able to help you guys just to find it all. Connie is also, as the secretary to the board, available. I'm not the only source, but I do think it is a lot for people unless we get it down to bullet points. And that's how we've heard from many of the board members. Just give me the bullet points. I don't want paragraphs. I don't want more. I want less. Synthesize it. Tell me exactly what you need us to do. So directing the board has become kind of an issue. And as I say, it started before COVID, but it really took wind during COVID when we were pulling people in who were not having that relationship with other board members. Alan put in the chat, strongly agree, Lori, the board has responsibility to monitor itself regarding things like conflicts and selection of members, having someone who can influence elected officials. And that is hard to do in this certain circumstance, but yeah, there's so much you can do, just starting with maybe we leave the governance plan to the side for a moment and agree that you like the process of this governance. Maybe we don't even call it Carver. We start to just build our own, if you would, and figure out exactly what pieces fit in this rather peculiar stacked order of chief elected officials, board of directors, staff.
Great. Thanks, Lori. So mindful of time, it sounds like the consensus is meet at least our next meeting month out or around there, and we'll circulate some suggested times. I don't know if early in the morning works best for people, but we'll figure that out. And to then have for our next meeting to really go through the bylaws. I have the bylaws here. It looks like there are 13 sections, 12 sections. Some are small as the name and purpose. So but in any event, if maybe what I'll ask is in the next few days, if anyone has any particular sections they want to focus on, thinking of Miguel's suggestion that everyone take a section or two, just shoot me an email And what I'll do either by the end of the week or beginning of next week, maybe send out an email to everybody, just if I haven't heard from you, just kind of assigning sections for you to kind of take a look at. And then we'll come to the next meeting really to sort of have a discussion about the bylaws and get some of our main feedback on that, so we can get that going. So before I wrap up, any additional thoughts or comments from anyone?
Great job, Joanne.
Joanne, this is Ken. I'll volunteer, as long as somebody else will join me, I'll volunteer for the board nominations process. And I'd love to have Lori participate in that as well.
Great. Thank you, Ken.
But I'd love to have someone else participate as well from the board.
I'd be keen on that, Ken.
Thanks, Harry. Harry, I noticed your picture was missing in that first photo of the governance group. I didn't see your picture in there.
Maybe it was embargoed. Maybe
Hopefully I didn't miss you, Harry.
Must have for being too ugly.
If I did, I owe you.
All right.
You know what? You're right. My apologies.
Too much early in the morning.
No, that was a big mess. So really appreciate the participation. I think this was a great conversation. What really came through to me is we really have the ability to make a mark on this organization and the future of this organization, and really look forward to tackling that with everybody on this call. And hopefully our work will do just that and really be a foundation that will last quite a lot for both the benefit of the board members to come and the organization most particularly. So thank you so much and really look forward to working with you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Joanne, for your
Bye.
leadership. Thanks for your leadership.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Y'all have a great week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thank you.